Welcome to the Think Christian podcast, where we talk about faith and pop culture because there's no such thing as secular. I'm Josh Larson, senior producer over at thinkchristian.net. The Star Wars galaxy has always carried religious overtones and spiritual implications. There's a reason we produced a Theology of Star Wars ebook a couple of years back. It's still yours for free, by the way. Just go to thinkchristian.net/Star Wars. With The Acolyte, the new streaming series over at Disney Plus, theological concerns come to the forefront. I mean, just look at the title, which carries clear church connotations. Centered around the Jedi at the end of the High Republic era, The Acolyte is a story in which we visit a Jedi temple, we witness a willowy golden tree that's something like the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we learn about a miracle birth, and we see a character offered absolution. So yeah, tons to dig into here. Let's get to it with the help of Joe George and Abby Olcese. Star Wars time on the TC podcast, and I'm happy to have a couple of friends here to help me talk through The Acolyte, which recently wrapped up its 8-episode run on Disney Plus. Joe George, good of you to take a break from Star Trek, do some Star Wars slumming. I appreciate that, sir.
You said it, not me.
And Abby Olcese is with us as well. Abby, you're no stranger to Star Wars, but I think the only other time you've been on the show to discuss Star Wars might have been a Rogue One conversation we had a while back. Does that sound right to you?
It does. It does sound right to me. Yeah.
Something like, I think we were covering one of your posts about films to celebrate Holy Week or something like that.
Yeah. I think
Rogue One is big for you there.
Yeah. I watch most of the Star Wars stuff. I tend to, commentary-wise, stick to the movies more than the TV show, but was happy to switch it up for this particular conversation.
Awesome. That's what we're going to do. It's The Acolyte, and The Acolyte is, I would say, it's full of action. I found that this gave good lightsaber for sure, which I appreciated. It's stuffed with Jedi. This is taking place about 100 years, if I'm understanding this correctly, 100 years before the events of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. So I think of that as like a century before Kitty Darth Vader, if that helps. That's how I kind of wrap my mind around where we are here. The main star is Amandla Stenberg, who broke through as Rue in 2012's The Hunger Games. Stenberg has dual role here, playing sisters May and Osha. When they were little girls, May and Osha were identified by the Jedi as Force sensitive. So a team of Jedi tries to take the girls from the women who are raising them. This is a coven, they call themselves, and they're pretty much space witches. And this confrontation between these women and the Jedi results in a tragedy that carries over into May and Osha's adulthoods, and that's where Stenberg takes over both of those roles. So there are many more characters, many more plot developments, including a Jedi Wookiee we get here, but that's probably enough to get us started. So let's just start with a general question. Abby, what did you make of The Acolyte?
I've kind of, complicated feelings about it. It takes a while to get going, and at least it did for me. And my theory here, and we can get into this a little bit more later, my theory here is because it is Jedi-centric. That is the reason. That I think the Jedi work best, for me at least, when there are like maybe one or two in a group, like a ratio. When you have all of them in one group together, it really feels like I used to do a film and faith festival at a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod seminary in St. Louis. And I was getting similar vibes, honestly. If you get like a whole room full of Jedi, it really just feels like you're hanging out with a bunch of seminarians with swords. And it, I don't know, it's not as fun for me.
I like this idea of a Jedi ratio that I'm going to now be applying that to any Star Wars production. Have we over Jedi'd here? I don't know if I completely agree with you. I'm definitely maybe more intrigued by the Jedi, but I think you might be onto something here, because their demeanor of being pensive and slowly walking and thinking things through perhaps does not lend itself to a propulsive narrative all the time.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's what's going on here. Did you find that to be the case too, Joe? How'd you feel in general about this?
I feel like I'm up on it a little bit more perhaps than Abby is. I've been very mixed on Star Wars past Return of the Jedi, really. And so this one I would put kind of on the upper end, even though I think it had some real problems. The fight scenes I think were fantastic all the way through. I think there was enough interesting concepts. I don't know that it entirely worked as a mystery. I don't know that all the performances clicked for me. So there was a few wet blanket things that were, it's not Andor, which is for me like, tops recently, but I think it's trying to be in a way that I
Yes.
appreciate.
Yeah, I think, Andor as well for me remains the high water mark, and this is well below that. You mentioned, the intriguing ideas and what is at play here. I think that's what drew me to this in the first place and carried me through the series. I don't know if the execution or exploration of those ideas was as rewarding as I would have hoped. And some of it has to do with the pensiveness, the pacing that you were talking about, Abby. A little bit the characterization, maybe we can get into that. And motivations. I found motivations, I don't want to say arbitrary, but a bit hard to follow. But overall, I do like the time and the particular world and the code of the Jedi that is given a lot of attention here. And should probably back up and say the showrunner here is Leslie Headland, who co-creator for the Netflix series Russian Doll before this. And then there are a handful of others. Leslie Headland directed a few of the episodes. Kogonada, one of my favorite filmmakers,
Yeah.
directed a couple as well, which I was surprised to see show up. So yeah, that's a couple of the creative names behind this series. And I did find it, as I was saying, always provocative, but in a way that I was waiting for the next episode to carry through on or fulfill. Does that track with you guys in your experience?
Yeah, I think
100%.
so. Yeah. I think it would usually approach an idea or end on a note that made me curious to see how it would get followed up on in the next episode. And I think also in terms of the ideas around the Jedi Code, especially the later episodes of the series, try to interrogate that a little bit in a way that I appreciated, that kind of leans close to some of the stuff that I liked about The Last Jedi, in similar terms of like disillusionment and what is reasonable to expect of the Jedi as a group and for the Jedi of themselves.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a re-examination of their place within this galaxy, and do they deserve to hold the revered status that they have throughout this Star Wars saga across all these films and TV shows. It's been, nibbled at here and there before, as you suggested, Abby, but this was a much more willing to ask questions of this Jedi tradition. And, that is what kind of brings us and makes it a natural thing to consider through the TC lens. That's one direction we could go, definitely, is the Jedi. We could start with the title of the show, Acolyte. What is a Christian understanding of the term acolyte? How does that match up against what an acolyte means here in the context of this show? To your point about interrogation, Abby, I see echoes of shameful church history in the setup here, in the plot. I mean, this is a religious order taking away children from their culture and families in order to indoctrinate them. And that reminds me of church-run boarding schools that were established in Canada and the United States and would take Native and Indigenous children away. So that's a parallel. How about the Bunta tree, a recurring motif, which is something like the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden? You've got that. And then lastly, one thing I always think about in terms of theology in Star Wars is the idea of Christian obedience. What obedience looks like in this force-filled galaxy. So the show gives us a lot. Did any of these aspects stand out to you with the Acolyte, Joe, or was there something else that struck you as particularly TC worthy?
All of those did jump out to me, but the one that I kind of felt emotionally, we're not in spoiler talk yet, so I need to be careful here, but questions of confession and forgiveness. It's a mystery show, right? We know that right from the first episode. The Jedi have done something, right? And it's kind of coming back from them. And as the show unfolds, there's a particular character who is steadfast that they've done the right thing up until the end, even when we sort of find out that they probably didn't. And I felt that repeated insistence of, no, my intentions were good, therefore I've done the right thing, and that utter fear that I'm going to lose everything if I confess. And confession and forgiveness are such integral parts of Christianity. You'd think that somebody like me, who was raised in Christianity and has been a professing Christian for 40 some odd years, would have that basic part down. But I totally saw myself in that character who just could not fathom forgiveness or being wrong.
There's a cost of confession, and that's what it feels like in this series. And that's what this character fears, is what will be the result of confessing, which I think probably does hold a lot of us back, even as we can intellectually understand the freedom that ultimately comes with confession. Before you get there is going to be a certain amount of cost to the status quo of where things are for you. And it's interesting, another character, aside from the one you're talking about, we'll get into spoilers later, but we are trying to be vague, is a Jedi who is more willing to accept what has happened and their part in it. And I think in that scene, the word absolution even comes up. And the choice is made to, yes, accept that cost. And in a weird sense, maybe we'll have to return to this in spoilers, perhaps achieve freedom, but I don't know. It's a high cost that character pays to receive what they're calling in the scene absolution. So yeah, definitely another thread that can be teased out in the Acolyte. Where did your attention go along these lines, Abby?
A lot of the stuff that came up as interesting for me that kind of really shifted my lens was stuff that showed up in the finale. There's one character who appears, and I feel like it's not a spoiler to talk about this because it's a comment that he makes, but it's one that kind of stuck with me. Who's an outsider, a senator who shows up and makes a comment to the leader of the Jedi that he doesn't super trust the Jedi because they keep everything so repressed that when it comes out, it really comes out and it's always bad. And so and then you contrast that with what we know of the dark side of the Sith, where it is all feeling and it is no reining back. But the way that he talked about that culture of repression and trying to keep everything inside and trying to keep everything calm versus the way that the Jedi talked about it really reminded me a lot of just the way that we talk about churches when things go wrong. What is the culture of that church? What is the culture that led to this incident of abuse happening? Why wasn't it reported properly? And oftentimes it is because things were being held back, things were being repressed, things were not being talked about that should have been talked about. And it was, again, a really interesting ingredient for me in the ongoing conversation about are the Jedi actually the good guys? Do they need some help? Do they need to look within and make some changes? Because as a kid, I was always no, of course, the Jedi are the good guys. They're good guys with the lightsabers and you never doubt them. Darth Vader is bad. The Sith are bad. It's very black and white. But as I think even as Star Wars as a franchise has gone on, we've seen that become questioned more and more in ways that I think are both reflecting the times that we live in and I think reasonable to ask of a series that has had that kind of black and white binary for so long.
Yeah, it makes you realize that, the Force is separate from the Jedi, especially in this story, and it's how the Force is wielded or how they interact with it. And, the main character here, or characters, May and Osha, this family of women who has been raising them, they're interacting with the Force as well, but just differently. But the Jedi come in and police that, right? They're very much police figures in this series. And I think your parallel to situations in the church is on in terms of that conversation at the end, Abby. I also think of it again in this notion of obedience and Christian obedience. Do we put our faith ultimately in obedience or in the grace and forgiveness that we've been given, and then we obey as a response to that? It's almost like those things get turned around a little bit. And the implication here by that senator is that the Jedi have that turned around in this context, right?
Yeah.
They're putting all of their faith, not really in the Force, but in obeying this religiosity they've placed around the Force. And to your point, when that requires never making a mistake at all, that's repression. That's going to cause someone to snap. That's going to cause someone to abuse the power that they have as Jedi. And it just highlighted to me how obedience can curdle if we expect it alone to save us, or if we see obedience as trying to do the work of grace. That's got it backwards. And that's kind of what the Jedi are being accused of here, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think you see that there's a specific episode later in the series. It's basically, I think, an episode-long illustration of what that character is trying to say, where by the time that he says it, you go, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've just seen it. I absolutely understand how that can go wrong. Here's an example.
Yep. So we've mentioned vaguely some characters. Maybe we should open this up to spoilers so we can talk more specifics and also talk a little bit about performance if there were characters that, resonated with us more than others. So if you're listening and you haven't started The Acolyte yet, or you're just a couple episodes in, from this point on, we will be discussing through the ending and digging into some of this a little more deeply. But Joe, let me ask you that question of character, and we can always jump back to any of these other ideas we've been talking about. But was there a compelling character? It might be the person you were already talking about, who carried you through the series more than others. Who stood out to you in terms of who we meet in this corner of the Star Wars galaxy?
Yeah, I have some issues with the performance, but Li Jingzhe's Master Soul is the one that I was thinking of. The issue with the performance is just that he's clearly not a native English speaker, and I felt like sometimes forcing him to give his lines in English and not asking the Wookiee to do the same thing. I don't know why he couldn't just speak his native language and then somebody could talk back to him. But, when he's got such an expressive face as a performer, and he just carried that guilt, and you felt his desire to do the right thing. I connected with him as a former, as a church kid who wanted nothing else but to do the right thing and has failed so much. I felt that in all of his performance. They saddle him with some pretty clunky lines that he communicated with his face. I don't know why they had to make him say it like that, but
Yeah, I can see that.
But he was just a really compelling character all the way through. I don't always know that Star Wars or Star Trek or like Superman or something like that, these kind of simplistic moral things can always carry the heavy load of shades of gray that people try to put on them. And so I was a little skeptical at times that they could do that, but he carried me through parts where I felt like the show was not quite grasping what it's reaching for.
Well, what this character is touching on in terms of shades of gray, and I agree the performance taps into in its physicality for sure, and those expressions you're talking about, it's the reality of how much worse it can feel if you think you're doing the right thing and then discover you did the wrong thing, but you still don't want to admit it. That's different than like doing something is wrong from the get-go, but it's almost like a rebellious gesture. I'm going to do it anyway. It seems to me that is easier to confess, maybe just in my experience, than when you thought you were in the right and come to realize you were in the wrong, and now you need to own up to it doubly. Sometimes maybe there's a greater weight, but I think that's in this performance, and that is the gray area that a series like this is exploring. I would push back a little bit. I think one of the compelling things, it's not this nuance, but about the original 77 Star Wars and that whole trilogy is exploring the good and bad within one person on both sides. It goes both ways with Luke and with Darth Vader, right? You start with the clear hero and the clear villain, and by the end of the third movie, they're kind of brought together and in some ways almost pass each other. So I know what you mean about the black and white. It is more like that in the original trilogy, but there's some nuance there. Here we're getting it in a much more sophisticated way. Did you have a character, Abby, that stood out?
I really do like Amandla Stenberg's performance as both May and Osha, and the way that Luke and Darth Vader kind of almost pass each other in the course of the Star Wars trilogy. I feel like the same is very true for them. And like you can see after a certain point, you're like, okay, this is where we're going. This will be interesting to see how it happens. And Osha's transformation, especially in the last couple of episodes, for me was really interesting in the choices that she makes and the reasons that she makes the choices she makes, which we're so used to seeing like the dark side of the Force presented as just like this person just decided to be really selfish and evil, and so they went over there. You don't really know their like personal motivations, but learning hers really just felt like, I get it. I think it would have been really hard for me not to make a choice like that based on my own experiences if that had been mine. I also really liked Carrie Ann Moss's character, Master Indara. Like earlier in the series, we get a flashback that shows May and Osha as children and their experience from their perspective of what happens to split them up. And then episode 8 is that same period, but told from the perspective of what happens to the Jedi, which colors a lot of things in a very different light. And watching her frustration at the people around her was like, for real. I understand. It made me think like, I wish it was okay for the Jedi to commit like a little bit of violence, not a lot of violence, but just like, I don't know, like a little bop on the nose when someone's being really stupid. Like if they had been able to really check each other, about 90% of the stuff that happens in that episode wouldn't have happened if we wouldn't have a series. But
Fair enough. Fair enough. You mentioned Carrie Ann Moss, and she is great. Of course, we think of The Matrix with her, and her fight scenes are fantastic.
They are,
Kind of this
yeah.
wuxia influenced. We get one in the opening episode. Mostly, we get that in the opening episode with her. The character, and this does get into spoiler territory, that I was drawn to was this stranger. This kind of, we're not sure if it's a rogue Jedi, or I guess sort of identifies himself as Sith at one point, but is identified just as the stranger in the credits. Manny Jacinto plays this part in, maybe, at least from what I only know him from The Good Place, the sitcom. So definitely a different shade he's offering here from what I've seen. Thought he was really good. Even when the reveal comes, we see him earlier posing as, a less intimidating character, let's say. But then he has to be revealed as this imposing, large, lightsaber wielding, force wielding bad guy in an intimidating mask that basically looks like the monster from Alien is what it brought to mind for me. But I really like that he still carried over little bits of slyness when he's revealed to be the bad guy. And I thought this character, this stranger, was especially, he got some great monologues about this idea of obedience that we've been talking about. And one of them comes shortly after he's revealed, or it's been revealed who he is. And he talks about how, he wants to wield his power, how he likes, not within the Jedi rules. And so my mind is going, that tree I mentioned, maybe I already had it here, but to the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve saying something similar is like, we've been giving these gifts, and instructed how to use them, but not good enough. We don't want to be stuck within those rules. And it goes back to this Christian understanding of obedience, right? Or is that these rules, God's laws, they're for our flourishing. Like they're to keep us on the path for a good life. That's the initial intent. And then, as I mentioned before, the other aspect of obedience is when we've fallen off that path and God has chosen to love us anyway, we obey in gratitude for that reality. Now you put that along the context of what's happening here, and you have the stranger basically saying, no, I'm not going to follow these laws. And what happens? Well, certainly not flourishing, right? In the wake of it, you get a lot of pain, a lot of anger, and even death. But again, going back to Jacinto, I love how he even says, this line about following rules.
Rules, rules, rules. If you never follow them, you never have to break them.
So I like that one because it's the slyness, it's this imposing figure, but he's bringing a little wit to the role too.
I found him to be a very compelling character and very both imposing and charismatic at the same time, to the point where, like, by the end of the series, I was like, he's not such a bad guy. And then I had to remind myself,
Yes.
no, he killed a bunch of people. He killed characters that you thought were going to be there the entire series.
Yeah.
And like
And
that guy's a murderer.
And I will say, I mentioned motivation before, and I understand that, OSHA's journey you followed, Abby, and was on board with, but that's where I got a little lost in the motivations, where it was like the willingness to, her past made sense, why she would consider it, but the willingness to align as much as she does with him, it was almost as if she had forgotten those things you were just talking about, for the convenience of having this switch of the sisters, where this was building towards.
And I think I'm going to push back a little bit on that, in that, like, when we meet her, she says that she left the Jedi voluntarily, and that you kind of learn through the course of the show that it wasn't necessarily voluntarily. It was because she felt like a failure. She was being made to feel like a failure because she couldn't keep her negative emotions in check. And then when you find out why those negative emotions exist, like, that is, for me, that's like all the motivation that I would need, is just to know that like you were lied to your entire life, and you are not, in fact, a failure. You are just a human being. And apparently the Jedi have no space for people who struggle with anything. And like, how do you not respond to that by going the opposite direction?
True. In that, I can totally understand her choices in the light of that. So we've kind of made our way there. But since we are in spoiler talk, how do we feel about the ending? I don't know why I thought this would be more conclusive. I never really understand how these series are working, how they're envisioned, what the plan is.
Yeah.
If they wait to see how the response is and then give another season, it kind of leaves things open ended. This felt like, at some point they decided we're just going to, kind of end with a cliffhanger. I don't know. I was a little dissatisfied. I wanted some more closure, even though a lot of character change had happened. It left me hanging a little bit. How about you guys? What do you think, Joe?
I kind of would be happy if there wasn't a second season. Not in terms of like quality, just
Interesting.
I kind of like I like where everybody is at sort of at the end, and I kind of like
Okay.
the question that's hanging over. I was a little disappointed to read just earlier today that they're talking about a second season.
And see, I felt like, oh, well, obviously they got to have a second season. So
Yeah.
where were you on it, Abby?
I think, Josh, I'm leaning more toward you than toward Joe. I feel like it does end in a place where it's like tantalizing enough that if it were to end after a first season, like it wouldn't be the worst thing. But given where, like, we've basically kind of switched allegiances between these two sisters, some really tragic stuff has happened. There's a lot of, I think, questioning and self-interrogation that's going on. That all of that, I'm curious to see where that goes. Particularly, I'm more curious to see what happens to May's character, since she ends up with the Jedi and with most of her memory erased, and having to be reminded that she has a sister, which is really heartbreaking. Which is not where I would have thought I would have ended up. I, for a lot of the first half of the series, found May really annoying until I found out just basically where she's coming from and realizing that no, that anger and behavior is way more justified than you thought it was. So she seems like a much more dynamic character now, I think, than she seemed at the start of the season, and I'm excited to see what happens to her.
Well, perhaps we'll reconvene then for that second season. Anything else either of you wanted to touch on, or you think we covered it? Maybe pro Wookiee Jedi, or do you feel like we got a little ripped off there?
I feel like every Wookiee side character has been disappointing. We got a Wookiee bounty hunter, and I don't remember what it was, and he gets his butt kicked immediately. When the Wookiee Jedi starts to fight, he fights like Alec Guinness. Like he's just slow and.
He's a big bulky guy.
Don't.
Yeah, all that fur is heavy, Joe. Come on.
Chewbacca did it all. We don't need another one. I feel like they're all disappointing.
I don't know. Maybe Wookiees are only good when you give them a bowcaster. That's all I got.
Yeah.
Or celebrating Life Day. Those are the only two ways.
Yeah. Those are the two extremes.
All right. Well, I'm glad we covered that. Thank you both. For keeping up with the Acolyte and coming on here to discuss it with me. Before I let you go, Abby, am I right? Pre-orders of your book are possible? Are we there? This is happening?
We're so close. Yeah. The book is out in October. Pre-orders are open wherever fine books are sold. I encourage you to do it through a local bookstore and support a local business if you can. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. I'm finally hitting the promotional trail and actually getting to talk more about it to people who can actually, read it and purchase it and check it out. So I'm excited about all of it.
And part of that is, you're going to have to tell people the title of the book.
Oh yeah,
so
sure.
We're getting you ready here.
Yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, you guys you weren't here for like the last season when we first introduced this concept. No, yeah, it's called Films for All Seasons is the name of the book, and it's out through InterVarsity Press on October 15th. It's a guide for movies to watch through the church liturgical calendar that originally started as an article series here at Think Christian.
All right, Films for All Seasons, excellent. Now, Joe. Also, I have this idea in a conversation at some point. You mentioned something about a project in the works as well. Is that something you can talk about? Or
No.
Better to point folks to your other writing that you're cranking out all the time.
Yep. You can find me on socials at Joe Writes Words. Not too much Star Wars stuff, but Star Trek stuff and especially superhero stuff. I've got a ton of that out there. So I'm Joe Writes Words everywhere, and you can find me yakking about something nerdy.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again, you two. We'll talk again down the road.
Thanks, Josh.
That Theology of Star Wars ebook I mentioned, one of my favorite things we've produced here at Think Christian. It's got essays on every film in the Skywalker saga, accompanied by these incredible custom illustrations. So again, if you don't have that yet, go ahead, you can get it for free at thinkchristian.net/Star Wars. And there is even more Star Wars coverage, podcasts, articles on the various shows, including some of the animated series, all over at thinkchristian.net. Just search for Star Wars and that'll all pop up. Not quite sure what we're going to be talking about for our next episode. If you have any suggestions, you can always connect with us on Facebook and Twitter/X. Find us at Think Christian. Our email address is tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net if you want to send us a note that way. And if you have a few kind words to share, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Star ratings are great. We'll take those. But if you could leave a sentence or two as well, that really does help us reach new listeners. And if you're watching us on YouTube, thank you. Please click that subscribe button. That'll help us there. Appreciate all of your help with spreading the word about TC. The TC Podcast is a listener-supported program of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more information. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder. I'm Josh Larson. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks to consider how another aspect of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.